Well, last week was the anniversary of the October 7 atrocities where young women were raped by Islamic jihadists as they went on a murderous killing and kidnapping spree in southern Israel. Daniel Lewkovitz is a security expert and commentator. He joins me now to discuss this and what Israel should do next to make the nation safe. Daniel, thanks so much for your time. I know you're very well connected with the Jewish community here in Sydney, but first of all, how are they holding up in the wake of what this unchecked anti-Semitism that has engulfed the left of Australia and, of course, our Muslim community over the last 12 months?
Well, the Jewish community has basically suffered a triple gut punch this week. The first gut punch was, of course, it's been a year since October 7, since the largest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. The second gut punch is that you've got people in Australia now openly and loudly calling for death to the Jews. And on October 9, a year ago, we sat and watched in disbelief as the New South Wales Police Force effectively stood back and did absolutely nothing while people stood on the steps of the Opera House desecrating it by calling for violence toward Jews. And the third gut punch is, having dealt with all of that, not being able to mourn their dead, watching demonstrators in the city effectively supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, is that a handful of members of the Jewish community actually went to the Opera House on the 9th of October to cleanse it, to reclaim it. And when they got there, they found a whole lot of police waiting for them to ensure that they couldn't do that. So we once again have a situation where there are places in Sydney that Jews can't go. And simultaneously, we have Jewish businesses in Sydney that are actually being defaced and attacked for no other reason than being Jewish. And it's really not a good time to be a Jew in Australia. And that's a real shame because the Jewish community has been very good to Australia. Australia has been very good to the Jewish community. And I think we're really at a pivotal point in our nation's development where we have to decide, what do we want this country to look like going forward? And I'm very concerned that the government are not making good decisions in that regard.
I couldn't agree more, Daniel. I've been appalled with what's happened over the last 12 months. It's been a big wake-up call. I've been amazed that the imams in Western Sydney in particular seem to be supporting Hamas and have allowed hate preachers in their mosques. And, of course, a terrorist organisation holding a protest last week, Hizb ut-Tahrir, on the steps of Lakemba Mosque. Imagine if St Mary's Cathedral held a protest run by a terrorist organisation. It's just unbelievable. I guess one of the other things, this might be a fourth gut punch, Daniel. A headline in the Australian newspaper caught my attention last week. Jason Clare, the Education Minister, saying that Israel was breaching international law by bombing hospitals. I think we've got a grab of his comments on ABC 24.
Every country has a right to defend itself, but it also needs to comply with international law.
Is Israel complying with international law?
Well, the bombing of schools and the bombing of hospitals, I think, are not complying with international law.
Now, he's dead wrong on this, isn't he? And the average punter looking at this might think how terrible of Israel to be bombing hospitals and schools, but it's not what it seems, is it?
Well, Jason Clare has basically fallen head first into a trap that was set for him by both Hamas and Hezbollah, who are specifically using human shields on this basis. Now, you don't need to be an international law expert, and I'm not, to be familiar with the concept that as soon as a hospital or a school or a private home is being used as a military outpost, that is, it's storing ammunition, it's being used as a base to launch attacks, it's being used as military headquarters, it stops being a civilian target. And, the problem is a lie can be around the world 3 or 4 times before the truth has got a chance to put its trousers on. So, of course, we will hear every time a hospital, does get attacked, and it does happen. There'll be video online and there'll be the whole world screaming that this is a war crime, but they always sort of start late in the narrative rather than looking at years and years of where those hospitals were being specifically used for a purpose for which they were never intended. Now, Israel doesn't want to be in this war at all, but it has no choice. And according to Jason Clare, if you're just going to simply say that a hospital and a school can never, ever be bombed, well, what you're essentially doing to terrorist groups is saying to them, all you need to do is set yourself up in an urban centre or in a hospital or in a school, and you have carte blanche. And that's the reason international law recognises very clearly when a school or a hospital or something like that is and isn't a fair target. And he seems to have missed the point. But I think the second criticism that I would level at him is this appears to be another example of the Labor Party trying to walk both sides of the street. So on the one hand, they're saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. On the other hand, they're saying but they can't. And which is it? Now, it's no secret that Jason Clare is an MP for a Western Sydney seat, which means he's essentially trying to appeal not only to the local Muslim vote, but also working on the premise that there's going to be a minority government at the next election. So he has to try and keep the Greens happy. Now, the problem is the Greens have never met a dead Jew that they don't like. So they're actually all in for Hamas, all in for Hezbollah, absolutely venomously against Israel. And so he's trying to play both ends. The strange thing is the entire Arab Muslim world has largely ignored or even rejected the Palestinians. So whilst you might drive around southwest Sydney and, sure, you'll see a PLO flag every now and then on the street corner, there's a lot more houses that don't have it. So I think for him to assume that all Muslims are in lockstep on this issue is also a very big mistake. But the problem for me is deciding, given the choice between supporting a modern liberal democracy such as Israel versus an Islamist dictatorship such as the Iranian regime or terrorist groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas, in exchange for a few votes, doesn't seem like a strong or an ethical choice for a politician to be making. And it's very, very scary what they're doing to get a few votes.
That's right, Daniel. I mean, the real problem here is the lack of moral leadership by the Albanese government. Surely they should be helping our Islamic community understand that Israel is not the problem. This is a just war, that people are falling for Hamas's propaganda coup. And yet that's not the case. The government continues to pander to those who support genocidal terrorism, and yet Israel are being painted as the ones committing genocide. Black is white and white is black.
Well, you see that all the time. I mean, Israel can be attacked by Lebanon, by the Palestinians, by Syria, by Iran, by Iraq, and yet people will still think that Israel is the aggressor and Israel started all the trouble. So this is the way their mindset works. But I think it's also important to note that there are any number of people in the Lebanese community and certainly in the Iranian community who recognise the difference between Hezbollah, the Iranian regime who's running Hezbollah, and what's actually happening on the ground. Israel and Jews worldwide have absolutely no problem with the Lebanese and have absolutely no problem with the Iranians. They're all wonderful people and we can all sit and have meals together. But the Iranian regime, which is controlling Iran and which by extension is bankrolling and controlling Hamas, and also Hezbollah, is an evil entity, and that needs to be crushed and stopped.
Well, let's go to Iran, and this goes to military strategy in Israel at the moment. Of course, Iran fired almost 200 missiles, including ballistic missiles, at Israel a couple of weeks ago. A response is imminent, could be any day now, probably this week. Do you think the Israelis should target Iran's nuclear facilities? Because it seems to me if they don't, it's only a matter of time before Iran is nuclear armed, and that changes the whole ballgame in the Middle East and in terms of global security.
Well, it does. And the fact of the matter is that the Palestinians are not an existential threat to Israel. Fundamentally, they're a nuisance, whereas Iran is potentially an existential threat if it goes nuclear, but not just to Israel, to the entire balance of power in the Middle East. And I think this is why a lot of people haven't noticed this, but once upon a time, whenever there was any conflict in the Arab-Israeli conflict, you'd have every Arab Muslim country screaming outrage, condemning them loudly. That's not happening this time because I think what's happened is a lot of countries in the Middle East, certainly the UAE, potentially even Saudi Arabia, have realised which is a productive, useful society and which one isn't. And so they're actually keeping quite quiet because I think they realise that if Iran goes nuclear or Iran's power increases, and certainly while you have weakness coming out of the White House in the US, they know who they'd rather have in their corner. They'd rather have America and Israel in their corner rather than a bunch of tin pot Arab countries that haven't won a war that they've ever started in their life. So this is having a real strategic change of power. And I think it's also why the Islamist groups now, whether that's the Iranian regime or whether that's Hezbollah or Hamas, are relying very much on completely clueless useful idiots in the West to push their propaganda barrow, because there are things that, a bloke that drives a taxi in Lebanon or a bloke that sells vegetables in Gaza knows about who's running the joint that outspoken inner city activists in Australia have absolutely no idea about, because they all went to the Instagram School of Middle Eastern Affairs and they don't know anything about what they're discussing. They just keep repeating slogans again and again, believing that's the truth and thinking that if you say the same lie over and over again, it becomes the truth.
Well, I think Israel will be doing a service to the world if they can strike those nuclear facilities and strike Iran so hard that it causes the mullahs to fall over and for that regime to topple. Just one final thing, Daniel, before you go. Since 1978, UNIFIL, the United Nations International Force in Lebanon, their job is supposed to have been to stop the militarisation of southern Lebanon. How well have they gone with that?
Well, I imagine there's probably viewers now going, UNIFIL, I've never heard of them. And you'd be right. And if you ever went on a tour of northern Israel and you stood at the border of Lebanon and you saw people walking around in blue helmets and you thought, who are they? Again, you'd be right. This was a United Nations interim force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, which was specifically started by the UN to stop the militarization of the south of Lebanon. And they haven't done a damned thing, which is why Israel now is not only under threat of Hezbollah rocket launchers that were put in the south of Lebanon right under the nose of UNIFIL, but they're also going from house to house. They're finding tunnels under there. They're finding weapons dumps. And these are not toy rockets. This is really serious armament that they're finding there. And you have to ask the question, what the hell has the United Nations been doing? I mean, this is an organisation that is constantly wagging its finger at Israel. They need to start either doing their own job before they do that, or Australia needs to start asking a very simple question, which is why are we involved with such a completely useless organisation? Whether it was UNRWA in Gaza, which was essentially paying the salaries of terrorists with Australian money, I might add, that Penny Wong sent, or whether it's UNIFIL in Lebanon, who've been sitting around drinking tea and twiddling their thumbs since the 70s instead of doing their job. We're all paying for that, and it's achieving very little. And unfortunately, once again, Israel's having to clean up the mess that was made by others. And it's not Israel's job to do that. Israel didn't want this war. Israel shouldn't have to go to this war. There should be peace in the Middle East. Gaza could have been turned into Singapore or Dubai or a thriving economy. Instead, they chose murdering Jews. Lebanon could have a functioning government. It could be the Paris of the Middle East once again. Instead, it's got Hezbollah running the joint. They're all paying for it. And unfortunately, we have useful idiots in the West who think that that's Israel's fault.
Yeah, well, if Israel don't win this war and if they don't strike Iran and cut the head off the terrorist snake, where this is going to continue to be a global problem, not just for Israel. They're fighting war on behalf of Western civilization. Daniel, thank you so much for that analysis today. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Lyle.